The deck at night. There was a ship, and it was still, and the night lay over it like a hand laid gently on the back of something sleeping. The sails hung slack and empty, filled with nothing but the dark, and the ropes that held them made only the smallest sounds, a creak here and a soft knocking there, as the vessel rose and settled on water that had grown almost too calm to notice. Overhead the stars were out in their uncountable thousands, and they were very bright, as stars are only ever bright far from any shore, far from any lamp or fire or the warm smudge of a town, where there is nothing between the eye and the deep field of the sky but the clean and patient air. A person stood at the rail. It does not much matter who, and it does not much matter when, for people have stood at that rail in every century that ships have crossed the water, and they have all felt, more or less, the same slow feeling. The person leaned upon the wood, which had been worn smooth by other hands, and looked out at the sea, which gave almost nothing back. There was no moon, or the moon had not yet risen, and so the water was not silver, but a deep and even black, a black that seemed less like a color than like a great quietness that had decided to take a shape. Now and then a low swell moved beneath the hull and lifted it, unhurried, and set it down again, and the sound of that was the sound of the whole night breathing in and out, with a patience that asked nothing of anyone. The water lapped against the side of the ship. That was the nearest sound, the closest and most companionable of all the sounds there were, a soft and repeated folding of the sea against the wood, never quite the same twice and never very different, a sound that a tired mind could lean upon the way a body leans upon a wall. And beneath that sound, or perhaps around it, there was the wider hush of the open ocean at rest, which is not silence exactly, but something fuller than silence, a sense of great distance in every direction, of miles and miles of dark water lying flat beneath the flat dark sky, meeting somewhere out there at a line that could be felt more than seen. It is a strange thing to stand upon the sea at night, and to know, in a quiet corner of the mind, that the water does not stop where the eye stops. The eye stops at the surface, at that black and gently moving skin, and it is easy, standing there, to let the sea become only that surface, only that near and lapping thing that holds the ship up and rocks it so kindly. But the sea goes down. It goes down beneath the keel and keeps going, further than the longest rope, further than the mind wants to follow, down into a dark that has never once been touched by the light of these stars, and the person at the rail knew this, in the way that everyone who has ever crossed the water has known it, and let the thought come and then let it drift, unhurried, out across the swell. This was the old feeling. It was not fear, not on a night as calm as this, but it was the near neighbor of fear, the quiet cousin of it, the simple and ancient unease that comes from not knowing what lies below. For all the long history of people upon the sea, the surface has been a floor that could be walked upon and worked upon and slept beside, and what lay beneath it has been a question, and the question has had no easy answer. Sailors have always known the top of the sea very well. They have known its moods and its colors, its currents and its winds, the way it turns from blue to gray to black. And they have known, just as surely, that all of this knowing rested upon a thin, bright layer, and that under the layer the water went on down into a place they could not go and could not see, and that this was simply how the sea was made. There is a long memory in that unease, older than the ship and older than the rail. People had been going out upon the deep for a very long time before this particular night, in vessels smaller and simpler than this one, steering by these same stars. The Phoenicians went a very great distance from their home waters, and it is held by those who study these things that they reached as far as Britain, far up in the cold north, across seas that must have felt to them like the very edge of the known world. And they went further still, for there is an old account that they sailed all the way around Africa, keeping the great continent beside them, and that as they went they reported something they had seen, that after a time they had the sun upon their right hand, that is to say, to the north. To us, so long after, that small report is a marvel of a gentle kind. That was the temper of the early sailor, to go out upon a sea that was mostly mystery, to notice what could be noticed, and to carry the strangeness home rather than be undone by it. They did not have the answers. They had the courage to keep looking, and the patience to remember what they saw. And underneath all their voyages, underneath every sail that Phoenician sailors ever raised, and every star they ever steered by, there was the same deep water there had always been, the same unmeasured dark below the hull, keeping its own counsel. They could measure the coastline and the harbor. They could measure the run of the days and the wheeling of the stars. But the true depth of the thing that held them up they could not measure at all, and so it stayed in their minds and in the minds of everyone who came after, a vast and quiet unknown, close enough to touch, and yet entirely out of reach. The person at the rail thought none of this in words, or thought only a little of it, the way one thinks at the end of a long day when the body is tired and the mind has gone soft and wandering. Mostly there was just the ship, and the stars, and the black and gentle water folding against the wood, and the great calm dark going down and down beneath it all. There was nothing to be done about the depths. There was nothing that needed doing. The ship floated, as ships do, upon the thin, bright film of everything that could be known, and below that film the mystery lay untroubled and untroubling, asking nothing, threatening nothing, simply being what it had always been. And so the night went on, unhurried, and the swell came and lifted the hull and set it down, and came again, and the water lapped and lapped against the side with its soft and patient sound. The old unease was there, as it is always there for anyone who stops to feel it, but on a calm sea beneath a full sky it had softened into something almost like wonder, into the plain and quiet knowledge that the world was far larger and far deeper than any one person could hold, and that this was not a thing to be feared, but a thing to be rested in. The stars kept their places. The sea kept its depth. And the ship, small upon the great dark surface, floated on through the still hours as though it had all the time there ever was. The edges of the known sea. Long before that particular ship rode its particular swell, other vessels had gone out upon the same water, and the people aboard them had felt the same soft unease and the same slow wonder, though the world they carried in their minds had edges much nearer than ours. For them the sea was not a thing that had been measured and drawn and folded into an atlas, but a living rim around the known, a widening blue that grew stranger the farther one went. To sail in that older age was, for the most part, to creep, adding a small new length of coast to the sum of what was known. Out where no land showed on any side, on the true offshore water, the depth beneath the keel became a thing no one could see. And it was that unseen depth, more than the distance or the weather, that seemed to press upon the imagination of those early sailors. A coast could be learned. A current could be watched and understood over many seasons. But the water directly beneath the hull, once the bottom dropped away from the pale shallows into that deep and steady blue, was a country that gave back no report at all. Something in that deep spoke of a vastness underneath quite as large as the vastness overhead, and far darker and far more silent. The sky at least had its lights. The deep had none that anyone could see. Still they went. That is the quiet marvel that sits under all the fear, the thing worth resting the mind upon on a calm night. For all the dread that the unmapped water carried, people kept going into it, kept nosing a little farther down an unknown coast, kept trading the safety of the known rim for the chance to see what had not been seen. And some of those voyages were long indeed, longer than we might expect of ships so small and charts so short. There is a story, held to be true by those who have studied the old accounts, that around 600 years before the Common Era, a king of Egypt named Necho II gave an order to a company of Phoenician sailors, men from that seafaring people, and that order was to go down the Red Sea and then to follow the eastern coast of Africa, keeping the land upon their side, and to see how far it went and where it might lead. It was a task with no known end, a sailing into a length of coast that no one aboard had ever traced. To picture them is to picture exactly the kind of small hull upon the great dark water that the previous night had held, only now against a coastline no chart described, in seas whose depth and temper had to be learned 1 league at a time. And about a century after that, around 500 years before the Common Era, another mariner went out along the same enormous continent, though from its other side. His name has come down to us as Hanno, a man of Carthage, and he turned south down the long Atlantic edge of Africa into water that grew stranger the farther he went. He is said to have pressed on as far south as the river we now call the Gambia, a distance that would have felt, to the people aboard, like sailing clean off the shoulder of the world, past the last of the familiar and into a coast known only by rumor, if it was known at all. There, too, the days would have unfolded in the old slow rhythm, the depth beneath falling away unmeasured. What is easy to forget, sitting comfortably now with the whole shape of the continents in mind, is how genuinely blank the far water was for these travelers, and how much courage and how much simple curiosity it must have taken to keep the bow pointed at the unknown. They did not know, as they went south, whether the coast would bend back or run on forever, whether the sea ahead held safe harbors or none, whether the deep beneath them was the same deep they had always sailed or some other and greater deep that swallowed ships. They had only the water in front of them and the will to see a little more of it, and they carried, as everyone who goes out upon the sea has always carried, both the wonder and the dread wrapped together in the same held breath. It helps, in the drowsy honesty of a late hour, to admit that the dread was reasonable. These were not foolish people frightened of shadows. They were reading a world that truly did withhold most of itself from them, a sea whose bottom they could not reach and whose far edges they could not see. When a chart ran out, something had to fill the space beyond its last drawn line, and what filled it was the imagination, populating the blank with whatever the mind supplied. And the blankness was real enough, the plain fact of an enormous unmeasured deep lying just past the reach of every eye. But it is worth noting, too, and worth settling into as the night deepens, that the fear never had the final word. Again and again, a voyage went out anyway, a Hanno turning his ship south, a crew of Phoenicians following an endless coast at a king's word, a small hull creeping a single league farther than any hull had crept before. The rim of the known sea was not a fixed and permanent wall. It moved. It was pushed outward, slowly, patiently, a coastline at a time, by people who felt the same unease anyone feels over deep water and chose to go on regardless, and who came back, when they came back, with the rim a little wider than they had found it, and the blank a little smaller, and the great deep still unfathomed beneath them, but a touch less strange along its upper edge. And so the sea that first ship floated upon, on its calm and star-filled night, was a sea whose edges had been carried outward by many hands over many centuries, each voyage adding its small length of coast, each returning crew handing on what it had learned to the ones who would go next. The depth beneath remained what it had always been, unmeasured and dark and patient, holding its silence as it held everything else. But the surface, at least, had been traced a little farther each generation, by people no braver and no more certain than anyone lying awake tonight, who simply kept their bows pointed at the unknown water and let the wonder outlast the dread. The old voyages were done. The ships were long since gone to whatever the sea does with its ships. And the coast they had followed, league by patient league, lay quiet under the same stars, waiting, as it had always waited, for the next slow hull to come feeling its way along the edge of the known. Here be dragons. There was a particular kind of quiet that belonged to an old map, and anyone who has ever unrolled one and leaned close over it in low light knows the feeling well. The sense of standing at the shoulder of someone long dead who was doing their honest best with what little they had. The coastlines came first, drawn firm and careful where hands had actually gone, where a hull had passed, and a person stood and looked and wrote down what they saw. Along those edges, the ink was confident, bays were named, headlands marked. But then, a little way out from the shore, the confidence began to thin, like a voice faltering when it is no longer certain of its words, until the drawn world simply stopped, and beyond it lay the part of the parchment that no one had filled because no one yet could. That blank was the true subject of the map, though the mapmaker would never have said so. It was the largest thing on the page, and the one thing the page could not describe, pale and open, the color of the parchment itself, representing not a place, but the plain edge of knowing, the line past which the making of the map had run out of people to ask. And into that blankness, over the long centuries of map-making, cartographers did a very human thing. They filled it with creatures, coils and fins, serpentine bodies rising from painted waves, open mouths and curling tails, beasts half remembered from stories and half invented on the spot to give the eye something to rest on where facts had failed. And these creatures were not really a claim about the world, they were a confession. They reported the exact location of the limit of understanding. A person drawing a map had, in front of them, a great deal of solid report about the shore and almost nothing at all about the water past it. They knew the depth close in, where a line could touch bottom, and the color of the shallows and the run of currents that a boat could feel. But the open sea beyond soundings gave them nothing to write down. No bottom their instruments could find, no landmarks, no measurements, only the vast unmarked surface and the enormous dark beneath it. And when a person has real knowledge shading into total ignorance, the honest thing and the frightened thing arrive together. So they drew the monster at the boundary, and that monster was, in its way, a piece of very careful reporting. There is a curious lesson folded into all of this. The sea did not need to be far away to be unknown. We tend to imagine that the blank places on old maps lay at the ends of the earth, off past the last island, out where no sensible hull would go. But the truth was closer to home and stranger. Consider that in the study of colonial New England, the coastal ocean and its seafloor, near and ordinary water lying just off the beaches, went for a very long time almost entirely unexamined by historians who came later. Scholars looking back had somehow overlooked roughly 100,000 square miles of it, an expanse of shore water and the ground beneath the waves that had been passed over as though it were not there. And yet, in its own time, that same overlooked water was known intimately by the ordinary villagers of the 17th and 18th centuries who lived along its edge. They knew it because they had to, where the bottom rose and fell away, which patches of water gave up fish, and which lay barren, which channels ran deep, and which would ground a boat at the wrong hour of the tide. They carried this knowledge not on parchment, but in themselves, handed from those who had learned it to those learning still, a whole living map that never touched paper and so, for a long time, never entered the histories at all. The blank on the scholar's later page was not a blank in the world, it simply went unwritten. The people who knew it had known it well and then passed on, their knowing going quiet with them, leaving only silence where that intimacy had been. So the blank places came in more than one kind. The true blank, the deep no line could reach or eye see, which mapmakers filled with dragons because they had nothing truer to offer. And the other blank, false but familiar, the water someone always knew but the record failed to keep, the ordinary sea just off the shore known intimately by fishers and forgotten by archives. Both looked the same on the finished page, pale and empty. And a person leaning over the map centuries afterward could not tell from parchment alone, which emptiness meant no one has ever known this, and which meant everyone here knew this once, but no one wrote it down. There were older reports too, drifting up out of the deep past, hinting at how far knowing had reached even when drawing had not. There is reason to believe, though scholars have not entirely settled on it, that Carthaginians sailing the western coast of Africa long ago came upon the strange, still region of weed-strewn water we now call the Sargasso Sea. If so, then the discovery lay very far back indeed, folded into voyages whose logs are lost, and crews left no maps to survive us. It is a possibility rather than certainty, and the careful mind holds it lightly. But it fits the shape of everything else in this chapter. Another instance of knowing that outran its own record, another place people may have found and touched and understood before parchment was ready to receive it, so that finding, if it happened, sank back into blankness and waited for someone to draw it again. And this, in the end, was the gentle truth beneath the fearsome one. Dragons on old maps were never really the point. They were placeholders, kind in their way, marking spots where a person had reached the edge of themselves and needed to leave a sign for the next traveler. Behind every painted serpent was someone who had stopped at the limit of the known, and rather than pretend to knowledge they did not have, drew the boundary honestly and let it stand. The monster said only this, "Past here I cannot tell you, past here you go on your own." And there was no shame in it, and no true horror either, only the plain and ancient humility of a person who knew the size of what they did not know. The sea, for its part, cared nothing for any of it. The blank on the page was not blank to the water. The dragon marked a place where the deep went on exactly as it always had, indifferent to whether a hand had drawn it or a story claimed it, holding its cold, dark rooms and unlit distances in patient silence. Maps grew and were corrected and grew again. Dragons were painted over, one careful generation at a time, as coastlines crept outward and blanks retreated toward the true deep where they still, in quieter form, remain. And the water simply went on being itself beneath all the ink, unbothered by names and warnings and beautiful frightened creatures drawn along its margins, waiting, as it had always been content to wait, for the slow, patient work of knowing to come feeling its way a little farther out from the shore. The banks and the gullies. Not all of the deep began far from land, and not all of it announced itself with dragons. Some of it lay close in, just off the coasts that people thought they knew. Beneath water they crossed so often that they scarcely thought of it as water at all, only as the road they took to somewhere else. And yet even there, even under the familiar grey swell that broke against familiar shores, the bottom was not the flat and simple floor that a hand might imagine when it drew a coastline and stopped. The bottom, under those near waters, was a country of its own, with its own hills and its own valleys, its own high places and its own hidden low ones, all of it drowned, all of it dark, all of it going quietly about the business of shaping the lives that moved across its surface without ever being seen. Consider the long shelf of the sea that reached, from the perspective of the men who fished it, west and south and west again, running from the cold waters off Newfoundland down toward the elbow of land that later maps would call Cape Cod. To a bird it would have seemed only sea, an unbroken plain of moving water stretching on and on. But to the fishermen, who did not have the bird's view and did not need it, the shelf was not a plain at all. It was a maze, a jumble of shallow banks where the bottom rose close beneath the keel, named basins where it fell away into gathered depth, submerged ledges that ran on unseen like the bones of some older landscape, and deep gullies that cut down between the banks and held the darker, colder, stiller water in their folds. All of this lay hidden beneath the ordinary surface, and all of this had a shape as particular as any range of hills on land, though no eye had ever looked upon it whole. The shape had been made, oceanographers would come to understand, by ice. Long before there were boats upon that water, or names for the banks, or men to speak the names, a glacier had lain across that country and then, over ages too slow for any single life to measure, had drawn itself back again, retreating the way a tide goes out, though far more slowly, leaving its signature written into the ground it uncovered. The banks and the basins, and the ledges and the gullies, were that signature, the tumbled, disordered handwriting of a thing that had passed and gone, pressing and gouging and dropping and dragging as it withdrew. And then the sea had come in over all of it, filling the low places, lapping over the high ones, softening the whole of it under a moving ceiling of water until the ice-carved land became sea floor, until the retreat of the glacier was hidden beneath the patient advance of the waves, and the shape remained where it had always been, only wet now, only dark, only silent beneath the traffic of the world above. The fishermen did not know about the glacier. They did not need to. What they knew was the water and what the water gave, and where it gave it, and this knowing was itself a kind of map, held not on paper, but in the body, in the memory, in the long accumulation of days spent reading the sea from the deck of a working boat. They knew the feel of the shelf beneath them, changing as they crossed from a basin toward a shoal, the way a walker on land might feel the ground begin to climb without needing to look down. They knew the names, and the names were a kind of possession, a way of holding in the mouth a place that could not be held in the hand. To name a basin was to claim, gently, that one had been there, that one understood it, that the invisible country beneath the boat was not wholly unknown, even if it was wholly unseen. And this drowned country, this maze of banks and gullies off the northeastern shore, turned out to be one of the quietly decisive places of the world. Oceanographers in a later age would give it a careful and unlovely name, calling it the Northeast Shelf Large Marine Ecosystem, a phrase built for precision rather than beauty, and beneath that phrase they would recognize something that the fishermen had always half known in their bones, that this stretch of hidden sea floor, overlapping the coasts of what would become New England and Atlantic Canada, had been crucial to the making of the whole Atlantic world. It was not a background to that world. It was one of its engines. Men crossed oceans to reach it, and stayed, and built their livings and their towns and their long-distance trades upon what the drowned country beneath them yielded season after season. The dark places under the keel were not empty. They were the reason for the voyage. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in the thought of it, that so much of what happened upon the surface of the sea, the boats, the harbors, the long knitted lines of commerce that stitched one shore to another across the width of the ocean, rested upon a landscape that almost no one ever saw. The men who profited from the banks did not see the banks. They saw only water, and the shifting weather over the water, and the birds, and the color of the sea in different lights. The banks themselves stayed below, in their perpetual dimness, doing what they had done since the ice withdrew, indifferent, in the way the deep is always indifferent, to whether anyone above understood their shape, or knew their names, or even guessed that they were there. And they were not so very deep, most of them, as the great abyss of the open ocean went. This was the near deep, the coastal deep, the deep that a sounding line could reach and a fisherman's instinct could read. The gullies were dark, but they were not the crushing, lightless distances of the true bottom far out to sea. The banks rose close enough that the living world above and the hidden world below stayed knit together in a single working whole. This was, one might say, the shallow end of the mystery, the part of the unseen that lay within reach of an ordinary boat on an ordinary day. And perhaps for that very reason, it was the part that people learned first and learned best, feeling their way across it with lead and line and long experience until its maze became, if never quite visible, at least familiar. It is a gentle thing to imagine, on the edge of sleep, that beneath the plainest stretch of coastal water, beneath a surface that looks like nothing but surface, there lies a whole landscape, patient and dark and beautifully arranged, with its high banks and its deep gullies and its basins, each holding their gathered pool of cold and quiet. The glacier that carved it is long gone. The men who read it by feel are gone too, most of them, their names and their boats folded into the same past that holds the ice. But the shape itself remains, down there in the dimness, unchanged and unhurried, still doing the slow work it has always done, still lying beneath the roads of the world as it lay beneath them all along. And the water goes on covering it, as water does, smoothing over the ice-carved country with its moving ceiling, hiding the banks and the ledges and the gullies beneath a surface that gives no sign of what it holds. There is no dragon painted on this part of the map, and there never needed to be. Here the deep was known, or knowable, close enough to shore to be measured and named and quietly relied upon. It asked for no fear and offered no threat. It simply lay there, useful and unseen, the drowned handwriting of an ancient ice, holding its cold dark folds in patient silence beneath the ordinary passage of the world. And it lies there still, exactly so, in the near dark just below the familiar surface, resting in its long and undisturbed repose. Carved by the ice. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs to things that were made slowly, and the floor of that shelf was made about as slowly as anything on earth can be made, so it is worth staying with it a while longer, out there in the dark below the moving water, and thinking not about what lay upon it, but about what had shaped it, long before any keel had passed overhead or any line had been let down to touch it. For the ground beneath that near sea was not a smooth and simple thing, not a flat plain sloping evenly away from the land, but a jumble, a maze, a country of many different shapes gathered close together, and every one of those shapes had a maker, and the maker had been ice. It helps, perhaps, to imagine the ice not as it is in a single moment, but as it moves across the long, slow time in which such things happen, which is a time so patient that a human night, however long it feels, is nothing to it at all. The ice had lain heavy over the northern land, and then, over ages, it had drawn back, retreating the way a tide retreats, but immeasurably more slowly, pausing and pressing and drawing back again, and everywhere it went it left its mark. And when at last it withdrew, it left the whole surface written over with the record of its passing, a record that does not fade quickly because the ground itself has been rearranged. And so the shelf that ran west and south, away from Newfoundland and down toward the long arm of Cape Cod, was not the work of the water at all, though the water lay over it and covered it and made it seem to belong to the sea. It was the work of the ice, and it kept the shape the ice had given it, and that shape was a complicated one. There were the shallow banks, the raised places where the ground came up nearer to the surface, broad and rounded. There were the basins, the low and gentle hollows between the higher ground, each one a wide and quiet pocket in the seafloor, and many of these had been given names by the people who came later to know them. There were the ledges, the submerged ledges, the harder ground that stood up in steps and shelves beneath the water. And there were the gullies, the deep gullies, the long narrow channels cut down into the floor, running between the banks like the beds of rivers that no one had ever seen flow. This was the jumbled signature of a retreating glacier, and there is something restful in that phrase, in the idea that so wild a thing as a wall of moving ice should leave behind it a signature, a mark set down and left, the way a hand leaves its writing on a page and moves on. The ice was long gone. It had withdrawn to wherever such ice withdraws, northward and upward and away, and it had left no trace of itself except the shape of the ground, and the ground held that shape faithfully, banks and basins and ledges and gullies all in their places, all exactly where the ice had put them, waiting under the dark, and even water with no ice remaining to explain them. There is a gentleness in that stillness that is worth resting in. The banks did not rise, and the basins did not deepen, the ledges did not shift, and the gullies did not fill. Whatever violence there had been in the making of that country had been spent long ago, spent so completely and so long before any watching eye that only the calm result remained, the finished handwriting with the hand withdrawn. It was a landscape entirely at rest, a landscape that had done its changing and was now simply itself, and the water moved above it, and the water was the only thing there that still moved at all. And it is worth remembering, lying here in the dark, how strange and how ordinary this was at once. Strange because a person standing at the rail of a vessel and looking down at that water would have seen nothing of it, only the plain grey surface giving no hint of the raised banks or the sunken basins beneath, only the level ceiling of the sea drawn smoothly over the whole uneven country as though it were flat. And ordinary because this is simply what the earth does. The ground has a history everywhere, on the dry land where we can see the hills and the valleys and read in them the shaping of old forces, and equally under the sea where we cannot see them, but where they are there all the same kinds of shapes made by the same slow kinds of making, hidden only because the water lies over them. The people who fished those waters, and the people who drew the early charts of them, came slowly to know this shape without perhaps knowing its cause. They learned where the banks lay because the water grew shallow over them. They learned where the deep gullies ran because the line went down and down. They learned the basins and gave them names, one after another, until the maze of the drowned country had a set of names laid over it, a human vocabulary spread across the ice's old writing. And in the naming there was a kind of settling, a kind of coming to terms, so that what had once been an unknown reach of water became instead a known and mapped and quietly familiar ground, the banks a place to expect fish, the gullies a place where the water deepened, the basins a set of hollows that a person could name and locate and rely upon. None of it needed to be feared. That is the thing that stayed true of the shelf, and it is a restful truth. Farther out and deeper down, there were places the imagination filled with dread, but here, close in, the deep was only the deep, only the ground the ice had carved and the water had drowned, cold and dark and complicated and altogether harmless in its long lying. There was no menace in a submerged ledge, there was no threat in a scooped-out basin. There was only the shape of the past, held under the sea, doing nothing at all except being what the ice had made it. And the water went on covering it, as it always had, drawing its smooth and moving ceiling over the banks and the basins, over the ledges and the gullies, so that the whole ice-carved country lay hidden and undisturbed beneath the ordinary surface of a working sea. Somewhere below, the ground rose gently toward a bank. Somewhere below, it fell away into a gully. Somewhere below, a basin held its wide and quiet dark, exactly where the retreating ice had left it, exactly as it had lain through all the ages since. Nothing hurried it, nothing changed it. The ice had done its work and gone, and the sea had come in over the work and stayed, and between the two of them they had made a place of the deepest imaginable calm, a floor with a history and no more restlessness left in it at all. So the shelf lay there, in its complicated and gentle shape, carved by an ice that no living thing had ever seen and covered by a water that gave no sign. It asked for nothing and disturbed nothing and simply endured, the slow record of an old cold season of the earth, resting under the plain grey surface in the ordinary night. It is a fine thing to think of on the edge of sleep, that patience, that stillness, the long-finished labor of the ice held quietly beneath the sea, the banks and the basins and the ledges and the gullies all lying just where they were left, in the dark, in the cold, in the deep and undisturbed repose of ground that has nothing left to do but rest. The sounding line. There was, for a very long time, only one honest way to learn how deep the water went. A length of rope with a weight tied at the end, lowered over the side of a ship, until the weight came to rest on something or until the rope ran out. It is worth pausing on how simple this method is, how nearly childlike, similar to dropping a pebble into a well and waiting for it to land, only stretched out over the width of the sea and repeated by countless hands across countless quiet mornings. A sailor leans at the rail with the coiled line beside him, feeding it out hand over hand, feeling for the moment when the pull goes slack and the bottom is reached. In shallow water, near a coast, in a harbour mouth or over a shoal, this worked beautifully. The weight went down, the rope went taut, the count was read, and the depth was known, a real number written into a log or called out across the deck, and the ship could proceed with some confidence about the ground beneath it. There is a great and underappreciated comfort in that, in knowing the floor is there and how far away it lies, much like the way it comforts a person in the dark to reach down at night and feel the solid boards beneath the bed. But the sea is not everywhere shallow, and this is where the sounding line began to fail, gently and completely, without any drama, but simply by running out of answers. A sailor would let the weight down over deep water and feed the rope out more and more, yet the pull at the end never changed, the weight never found its rest, and the slack he was waiting for never came. He could lower every foot of line the ship possessed, and still the weight would hang out there in the dark somewhere below, swinging faintly, touching nothing. The sailor would have to haul it all back up again, arm over arm, wet and heavy and dripping, having learned only that the bottom was farther down than his rope was long. That was the whole result of the labor on so many days, in so many places, a single quiet fact stated in the negative, not here, not yet, deeper than this. It is easy, from a comfortable distance, to underestimate what that meant to the people who felt it in their hands. To lower a line and have it stop is to be given a floor, an edge, a limit, a place where the world firms up and holds. But to lower a line and have it never stop is to be given nothing to hold at all, an opening downward with no felt bottom to it, a depth that simply absorbed every length of rope offered to it and asked, without any voice, for more. And the deep water was patient about this in a way that the men were not. for the men had only so much rope and strength and daylight, while the water below them seemed to have no flaw within reach and no interest in providing one. So for a long stretch of human seafaring, the picture of the deep ocean was, in a sense, a picture full of blanks, not because no one tried to fill them, but because the tool for filling them could not reach. The shallow edges of the world were known, measured, charted, dotted with careful figures. Then, a little farther out, the numbers thinned and grew doubtful and finally stopped altogether. There was only the open blue of the chart and the understanding, held quietly by everyone who sailed, that beneath it lay a depth their ropes had never sounded and might never sound, a flaw that had refused, so far, to answer. It was not a frightening blank, it need not be, it was simply an honest one, the map admitting where the line ran out. And what the line could not reach, in the end, was very far indeed, farther than those early sounders could have easily imagined even on their boldest days. The deepest place in all the world's oceans, a long furrow in the floor of the western equatorial Pacific, called the Challenger Deep, lies about 11 kilometers below the surface, which is to say roughly 11,000 meters of water stacked one layer upon another between the waves and the bottom. No coil of rope a wooden ship could carry would ever have paid out that far. The weight would have hung for hour upon hour in the darkness, descending through layer after layer of cold, and even then, at the limit of every rope aboard, it would not have come near to touching that deepest ground. The sailors who leaned at the rail and felt their lines go slack over deep water were feeling, without knowing its measure, the outer edge of something on that scale, a depth that swallowed rope the way night swallows a small light held up against it. There is something restful, though, in imagining those patient hands at their patient work, precisely because they were not hurried and not, in the end, defeated by what they could not reach. Morning after morning, a sailor would coil the wet line back onto the deck, note down what little he had learned, stow the weight, let the ship go on, and the sea kept its deepest flaw to itself for a while longer. None of that was any tragedy. It was simply the slow, decent limit of a simple tool, honestly used, a rope and a weight, and a person willing to wait for the pull, doing the best that rope and weight and patience could do. The deep was not being cruel in withholding its bottom. It was only very large, and the rope was only very long, and between those two truths lay a great quiet space that no one, for many generations, could measure, and that space was allowed simply to remain, unmeasured, in the dark, beneath the keel, while the ships passed over. To think of it now, on the edge of sleep, is to think of that gentle refusal without any unease at all, the weight going down through cold water on its long unspooling thread, turning slowly, seeking a flaw it would not find that day. The hands above feed out the line with the unhurried steadiness of people who have done a thing many times and expect nothing sudden from it. The rope hangs in the deep, the water holds it, the weight descends and does not land, and no one is harmed by this. The ship rides quietly on the surface in the ordinary night, and the deep keeps its measure a little longer, patient, enormous, calm, a flaw still waiting, far below every rope ever lowered, to be found in some later and gentler age. The Voyage of the Challenger. And in that later and gentler age, though it was not so very gentle to the people living in it, only ordinary to them, as our own days are ordinary to us, there came at last a voyage whose whole purpose was to answer the sort of question that the hanging line had left unanswered. Not a voyage to carry cargo from one port to another, and not a voyage to find a shorter way to somewhere already known, but a voyage undertaken simply to look, lower, lift, and write down what came up. It is a curious and restful thing to imagine such a purpose, because there was no urgency in it of the kind that hurries the heart. The ship was not fleeing anything, and was not chasing anything. It went out onto the wide water in order to be slow on purpose, to stop again and again in the middle of the sea where there was nothing to see in any direction but the horizon, and to let its lines go down into the dark for no reason other than to learn what the dark contained. Picture then the deck on one of those working mornings, calm and businesslike, the light coming level across the water and warming the boards. The stopping places had no names, each a patch of open ocean indistinguishable to the eye from the patch before it and the patch that would follow. The people aboard had made a habit of arriving nowhere and treating it as somewhere. They would bring the ship to rest, and the sea would go on moving beneath them in its slow, unbothered way, and the work would begin, the same work it had been the day before, the same work it would be the day after, carried out with the calm repetition of hands that had long since stopped being surprised by the size of what they were sampling. Down went the lines, as they had gone down before, but now with a fuller intention behind them, for the aim was not only to find the floor, but to gather what lived above it and upon it, and within the drifting water between. Up came the hauls, dripping and cold, emptied gently onto the deck to be sorted. And here is where the slowness of the enterprise becomes something almost tender to think about, because each small creature that arrived from below was not simply glanced at and thrown back, but looked at closely, turned over, compared with the others, set aside, and eventually described in careful words and given a place in a great and growing catalogue. The work of the voyage was, in the end, the work of counting and naming, which are among the oldest and most soothing of human occupations, to take a great confusion of things and sort them patiently into their kinds. And when the sorting was done, and the long columns of names were laid one beside another, a plain and steadying pattern showed itself in the tallies. Across the regions that had been surveyed, 3 broad groups of living things turned out to account for a very large share of everything that was known: the crustaceans, which are the crabs and shrimps and their many jointed relatives; the mollusks, which are the snails, shells, and soft-coiled creatures of that family; and the fishes, which the old naturalists set down under the name Pisces. Together, these 3 kinds made up something close to half of all marine species known across those waters. Half of the whole living inventory of the sea, so far as it had then been gathered, belonged to just these 3 great households of life. It is a fact that settles the mind rather than stirring it, because it means that the vast strangeness of the ocean is not wholly formless. It has its main lineages, its familiar branches, its great returning shapes, the armored and shelled and finned, repeated over and over through the water in numbers beyond easy imagining. And much of what came up on the deck, once named, turned out to be a cousin of something already named before. But alongside that orderly half lay the other half, and beyond even that there lay a further truth that the voyage revealed almost by accident, simply by the honest smallness of what one ship could reach. For all its years at sea, the expedition had touched only a scattering of points across a body of water that covers most of the world. Each lowering of the line sampled one small circle of the deep, and between those circles lay uncounted miles that no line had ever entered. The catalogue, thick as it grew, was a catalogue of glimpses. And so the plain conclusion, drawn without alarm, was that many of the sea's habitats had been poorly sampled, and that this was especially true in the deeper places, where the reaching is hardest, and among the smaller organisms, the little abundant living things easy to overlook and belonging to groups rich in species no single voyage could hope to number. There is a kind of comfort in stating that openly, and it is worth resting on for a moment before sleep. It would have been easy, and might once have been the fashion, to pretend that the counting was finished, that the sea had been read to the bottom, that the volumes on the shelf held the whole of it. Instead, the honest report was the humbler one, that a great deal remained unstudied, that deeper seas in particular had been only lightly touched, and that whole families of the smallest creatures were still barely known at all. This was not a failure and was never spoken of as one. It was simply the true shape of the situation, and it remains, in its patient way, true even now, that many deep habitats are still poorly sampled, and some of the most species-rich groups, especially among tiny organisms, are still poorly studied. The work that the voyage began was not the sort of work that ends, it was the sort of work that opens. And so the picture that the expedition left behind was not one of a sea conquered, but of a sea entered, and only just entered at the edge. Imagine the map of it, the wide blue nearly everywhere, and upon that blue a modest scattering of marks, each mark a place where a ship once paused and let its line go down and drew a little of the deep up into the light to be named. Between the marks lay unvisited water, mile upon mile, holding its living things quietly as it had always held them, unnumbered, uncounted, waiting in the same patient way that the unfound floor had waited beneath the hanging weight. The half-known and the half-not, and beyond both of them the far greater portion no reckoning had yet reached, crustaceans, mollusks and fishes past counting, and the small unstudied multitudes among them, going about the slow business of being alive in the dark, entirely undisturbed by the fact that no one had yet written them down. To think of it on the edge of sleep is to feel the very opposite of dread. The deep was not emptied of its mystery by being sampled. It was shown to be far larger than the sampling, and that largeness is a kindness now, a room with no walls in sight, in which there is always more, and the more is not threatening, but simply there, waiting without impatience to be found in some further and gentler age still to come. The ship had done its work and gone home. The volumes stood on their shelves, precise and calm, half of the known life gathered into three great and familiar kinds, and an honest note written plainly beside them that deeper waters had scarcely been touched. And the sea itself carried on exactly as before, unhurried, unharmed, unfinished, holding its uncounted creatures gently in the cold, keeping the greater part of its catalogue for later, in no rush at all to be fully known, so that even now, lying still in the dark, one can rest inside the pleasant knowledge that most of it remains out there, quiet and enormous and entirely at peace, waiting to be gently found. Below 6,000 meters. Down and down the imagined descent had already carried the mind, through the sunlit shallows and the dimming middle water and the long dark plains of the abyss, and now, past the mark of 6,000 meters, the water entered a region that had earned a name of its own. The Hadal Zone, the deepest reach the ocean anywhere allowed itself to fall. It was worth pausing here, in the slow way one pauses on a stair to feel how far one has come, and to notice that this deepest layer was not simply more of the same darkness, stacked a little lower. The great plains of the abyss, wide and even and going on for enormous distances, did not slide smoothly downward into these final depths. Instead, the Hadal region kept itself apart. It was, for the most part, a scattering of trenches, long narrow furrows cut into the seafloor where one great slab of the earth's crust bent slowly beneath another. These trenches did not join hands with one another. They did not run together into a single continuous floor, but sat instead as separate places, isolated clusters, each one holding its own pocket of extraordinary depth somewhere between 6,000 and 11,000 meters down. There was something restful in that fact once the mind settled into it. One might have supposed, drifting down in imagination, that the deepest ocean would be a single unbroken basement to the world, one vast connected cellar into which everything eventually descended. But it was not so. The ordinary machinery of the seafloor, the gentle logic by which the shallow shelf near the land gave way to the sloping rise, and the rise gave way in turn to the broad abyssal plain, that patient and continuous stairway did not lead here at all. The Hadal trenches lay outside, that ordering, apart from that continuum, formed by a different and slower process altogether, and so they existed as a kind of separate deep, dotted here and there across the wide floor of the world, each one quiet and complete in itself. One could picture them, without alarm, as long valleys sunk into the deep, their walls falling away on either side. Their length was far greater than their width, running for great distances the way a seam runs through cloth. And because they were made where the crust folded downward, rather than where sediment had spread itself flat and wide, they did not connect. A creature living near the bottom of one such trench, had it been able to wander, could not simply have crossed some low threshold into the next, for between them stood the ordinary abyssal floor, itself thousands of meters shallower, a barrier of relative height as surely as a ridge of mountains stands between two lowland fields. Each trench was, in this way, an island turned upside down, an island of depth rather than of land, cut off from its neighbors not by water, but by the very shape of the earth beneath the water. It helped, lying there in the dark, to let that image grow slowly. Not a single yawning pit, but a handful of separate and orderly places, geographically isolated, each keeping its own cold and its own stillness, each holding whatever lived within it in a quiet that had gone undisturbed for a very long time. There was no menace in the isolation. It was simply a fact of arrangement, the way certain valleys on land are hidden from one another by the hills between, so that the traveler who has seen one has by no means seen them all, and each must be come upon separately, in its own season, by its own long road. And this was the region, the note said plainly, that remained the least explored of all the living places on the earth. Not the least explored corner of the sea only, but the least visited part of the entire watery biosphere, the whole enormous domain of living water, from the brightest shallow to the darkest floor. Of all the places where life was known to hold on, these deepest trenches had been reached the least, looked upon the least, understood the least. And the reason, gently considered, followed straight from what had already been said. Because the trenches were scattered and separate, because they did not lie along any single continuous floor that a vessel might follow from one end to the other, each had to be sought out on its own, one at a time, across great distances of ocean, and lowered into, or descended into, or listened to, apart from all the rest. There was a pleasant humility in that, and no shame at all. The chapters before had told of the long labor of measuring the deep, of the weighted lines paid slowly out over the rail, of the patient ship that crossed the world sounding and hauling and cataloguing, and of the honest note written beside its shelves that the deepest waters had scarcely been touched. Here, past 6,000 meters, was the plainest form of that same truth. This was where the untouched still gathered most thickly. This was the far edge of the map, marked now, if it were marked at all, with the quiet and truthful acknowledgement that here the ocean kept the greatest share of what no one had yet seen. The mind, drifting, might try to furnish such a place, and it was allowed the ordinary furnishings of the deep, the cold that did not vary, the darkness that was total and unbroken, the immense and even weight of all the water stacked above, pressing without hurry from every side at once. But beyond these plain and observable things, there was little to insist upon, and that was perhaps the gentlest fact of all. One did not have to fill the trenches with anything. One did not have to decide what moved along their floors or drifted through their long black water. They could simply be left as they were, present and real and mostly unvisited, holding their contents patiently, in no hurry to be catalogued, entirely content to remain unknown a while longer. It was, in truth, a comfort of the same kind the whole voyage down had offered. The deepest floor was known to be there, and known roughly where, and known to sit at particular depths, in particular separated places, and this knowing took nothing away from the wonder. The Hadal trenches were real, located, bounded, and yet still almost wholly unexplored, and there was no contradiction in that, only the ordinary and restful condition of a world too large to have been walked over all at once. So the descent could be allowed to reach its end here, at the bottom of one of these quiet furrows, wherever the imagination had chosen to settle. And there was nothing at that bottom that needed to be resolved or escaped. The water lay heavy and still and cold. The trench held its long shape, sloping up on either side toward the far higher plane that separated it from all its distant kin. And somewhere across the dark, unconnected and unreachable across that plane, other trenches held their own stillness in exactly the same way, each one apart, each one deep, each one waiting in the manner that deep places wait, which is to say without any waiting at all, simply persisting, cold and patient and complete. There was no need to climb back up in a hurry, and no need to linger anxiously either. The deepest ocean had been reached, in the mind at least, and found to be not a mouth or a pit or a bottomless dread, but a set of quiet and separate valleys, the least seen of all living places, holding their long patience in the dark. And one could rest inside that softly, the way one rests inside any fact that has stopped needing to be feared, letting the weight of all that water settle over the thought like a blanket, cold above and calm below, the last and deepest layer of the sea lying exactly where it had always lain, isolated and enormous and unhurried, keeping its greater share of secrets gently and asking nothing of anyone at all. The shape of the trench. There was a habit of mind, an old and understandable one, that pictured the bottom of the sea as a single flat thing, a floor in the plainest sense, level and grey and unbroken, the way a room has a floor that one does not think about because it is simply there beneath the furniture, holding everything up. It was a restful picture in its way, and it had served the imagination for a very long time, because a flat and featureless place asks nothing of the person imagining it. There is nothing to walk across, nothing to lose one's footing on, only an even darkness spread from wall to wall of the world. Yet the deep valleys at the very bottom of the ocean, the long trenches that had been the subject of so much quiet wondering, were not floors in that sense at all, and the more carefully they had been studied, the less they resembled anything so simple as a single tilted plane, so that a person drifting towards sleep might set the old flat picture gently aside and let a more interesting country take its place. For the trenches, it turned out, had a shape, and the shape had parts, and the parts had names, and the names were the ordinary tender names that the surface of the earth already knew. There were ridges down there, long raised lines of the seabed lifting themselves out of the surrounding dark. There were escarpments, which are simply steep drops, the places where the ground stops being level and falls away in a face or a step toward some lower ground beyond. There were basins where sediment gathered, wide shallow gathering places that held the slow settling of everything that fell. There were seamounts, which are the rises that stand up alone, high ground in the middle of low ground, mountains by any fair reckoning, sitting quietly at a depth where no one would ordinarily think to look for a mountain at all. And there were the deeps themselves, the deepest hollows within the deep, the low points of the low places, so that even at the bottom there was a bottom, even in the last valley there was a lastness, one further quiet fold set into the floor of the fold. It was worth resting on that for a moment, the plain fact that a trench was not one thing but a landscape, because a landscape is a far gentler thought than a pit. A pit is a single idea, a hole, a lack. There is nothing in it to consider and nothing in it to love, only the going down and the being far. But a landscape is made of relations, of this rise leading to that hollow, of one long ridge running parallel to another, of the ground climbing here and settling there, and a landscape can be walked in the mind the way a familiar valley on land can be walked, unhurriedly, from feature to feature, without any need to arrive. The trench held all of that. It held its ridges and its basins, and its lonely seamounts arranged across enormous distances, spread out along the length of the deep in a variety that no single flat word could have held, and the scientists who had studied it had been careful to say so, to catalogue the sedimentary basins and the ridges and the escarpments and the deeps and the seamounts as a way of insisting quietly that this was terrain and not merely a measurement. And the terrain was not the same everywhere within itself, which was perhaps the most restful discovery of all. There was a difference, they had found, between the flanks of the trench and its axis, between the long sloping sides that led down and the deep central line where the two sides met. This is a thing that any valley on land also knows, the difference between the hillside and the streambed, between the ground one descends across and the ground at the very bottom where everything eventually comes to rest. And it was a small comfort to learn that the deepest places on earth kept that same familiar arrangement, a middle and its margins, a lowest line with two long shoulders leaning toward it out of the dark. The flanks were one kind of place, and the axis was another, and the whole of it varied from stretch to stretch, so that no single description could ever stand in for the trench entire. It changed, as real places change, along its own great length. Even the ground itself, the very stuff underfoot in that country where no foot would ever fall, was not one substance, but many. Here the scientists were more careful, more tentative, because this was newer knowledge and less settled, and they would have been the first to say that the picture was still coming into focus rather than finished. But the leading understanding, as it stood, was that the seabed of the trenches was made of different materials in different places, that its very composition varied from spot to spot the way soil and stone vary across any wide land. In some places there was sediment, the fine, slow accumulation of settled things, gathering soft and deep in the basins. In some places there were what they called mass movement deposits, which is to say the material that had come down from higher up, slid or slumped or carried from the flanks toward the lower ground, laid out where it had finally come to rest. And in some places there was bedrock itself, the bare stone of the trench, outcropping through everything else, the underlying frame of the world showing plainly where no soft blanket of sediment had covered it over. Soft ground and slid ground and bare stone, three kinds of underfoot in the one dark valley, and the varying of them was itself a feature of the place, one of the things that made it a somewhere rather than an anywhere. There was something almost domestic in all of this, if one let the thought soften far enough. A landscape assembles itself out of processes that are none of them hurried, and every one of the features had a story of patience behind it. The basins held their sediment because sediment falls slowly and settles and stays, layer upon layer, over lengths of time that the mind cannot really hold and does not need to. The mass movement deposits were the record of ground that had once let go of a higher place and come gently or not so gently to a lower one, and then simply lain there afterward, resettled, at peace with its new position. The bedrock waited under everything and appeared at the surface only where no soft covering of sediment had arrived to hide it. To picture the trench, then, was to picture a whole geography of slow settling and slow sliding and long unmoving stone, arranged in ridges and escarpments and basins and deeps, and left, for the most part, entirely alone. And so the old flat floor, the featureless grey plane of the imagination, could be allowed to dissolve, and in its place there could stand a real country, unlit and unvisited, but not therefore empty, having its high ground and its low ground, its steep places and its gathering places, its bare stone and its soft accumulations, its long central line and its two leaning flanks. It was a landscape that no one would ever cross on foot, that no eye had ever taken in whole, and that changed along its length the way honest landscapes do, refusing to be summed up in a single glance or a single word. There was no need to survey it all before sleeping. There was no need to hold the whole shape at once. It was enough to know that the shape was there, various and unhurried, and that it had been there all along beneath the plain grey picture, waiting to be understood as terrain rather than as a mere depth. One could let the mind come to rest somewhere in that country, on the gentle shoulder of a flank perhaps, or in the soft floor of a basin where the sediment lay deepest, or simply anywhere along the quiet axis where the ground was lowest and the water lay heaviest and stillest of all. Wherever the mind settled, the landscape held it, ridge and escarpment and deep alike, all of it slow, all of it exactly as it had arranged itself over ages without any witness and without any need of one. The trench had a shape, and the shape was calm, and the shape asked nothing, and a person could lie down inside the fact of it as easily as lying down inside any true and finished thing, and let the long dark country keep its patient form around the edges of sleep. 3 trenches mapped. For a very long time, the deep had been imagined as a single thing, one darkness lying under all the water everywhere, undivided and everywhere the same. If people thought of the trenches at all, they thought of them as versions of one another, holes of the same kind, differing only in how far down they went. It is an easy thing to believe, when you cannot see a place, that it must be plain, that the parts of it you have never visited must resemble the parts you have imagined, and that the only meaningful question about any deep place is the oldest and simplest one: how deep, and how much deeper, and deeper than what? The mind reaches for a number because a number is a thing it can hold, and for a long time the number seemed the whole of the story and nothing else to say. But there came a study, careful and patient in the way these things are, that set out to ask a different question of the deep, and that turned its attention not to one trench, but to 3, the Mariana, the Kermadec, and the New Hebrides. These trenches lay far apart from one another in the wide body of the ocean, each with its own long axis and flanking slopes, holding their own water. What the study did, for the very first time, was look across all 3 at once, and compare them not by depth alone, but by the shape of the ground, by the fine grain of the places within them where a creature might live, and by the sediments that had gathered and settled across their floors. To do this, the people who made the study gathered together the best maps of the seabed that could be had, the bathymetry, as it is called, which is simply the record of how the bottom rises and falls. To those maps they joined something else, a great collection of images made by landers, patient instruments that ride down alone into the dark, rest on the bottom, and watch. This was the largest such collection ever assembled, spanning the full range of depth in all 3 trenches, from the higher ground of the adjacent slopes down along the descending walls and into the deepest reaches of the floor, so that no part of the vertical journey went unwatched. With the maps beneath and the images layered upon them, the study could at last describe these 3 places as places, with textures and neighborhoods and differences, rather than as 3 deep numbers set side by side. What emerged from this looking was quietly surprising, running against the old and simple idea. For it had long been supposed that the one great force ruling the deep was pressure, the enormous weight of all that overlying water bearing down, growing heavier with every meter of descent. It was supposed that this pressure, being so vast and unlike anything at the surface, must be the thing that shaped everything, sorting the living from the impossible, dictating what a trench could be. Pressure is real, and it is great. No honest account of the deep would leave it out. But the study found, and here the science is still settling, and the researchers themselves speak with proper care, that pressure was not the sole author of these places. The trenches differed from one another and within themselves in ways that pressure alone could never explain. The leading idea, as it is coming to be held among those who study the Hadal Deep, is that these trenches show heterogeneity, a long word for variety, for the quality of a place being made of many different smaller places rather than one uniform stretch. This variety, the researchers suggested, was comparable in its degree to what is found in other zones of the sea, in the shallower and better-known regions that had never been thought of as monotonous at all. The deep, in other words, was not the exception it had always seemed. It was various in the ordinary way that living places are various, patched and textured and local, one corner of a trench floor unlike the corner beside it, one trench unlike the next. And the causes of this variety, so far as they could be named, were more than one. There was the matter of geographical isolation, the plain fact that the three trenches lay far from one another with the great width of ocean between them, so that each was in some sense its own island of depth, cut off, keeping its own company, developing along its own line. And there was what the researchers called the biochemical province, a way of saying that different regions of the ocean carry different chemistries and different supplies of the stuff of life, so that what rains down from the sunlit surface toward one trench is not quite the same as what rains toward another, each deep floor fed by the particular waters that happen to lie above it. Between the isolation and the province and the shape of the ground itself, the trenches came to be understood as distinct from one another, three characters rather than three copies, and the old picture of a single undivided darkness quietly gave way. It is worth resting a moment on how gentle a discovery this really was, for all that it overturned an old assumption. Nothing dramatic had been found, no creature to fear, no chasm without a flaw, only that the deep places of the world were more themselves than anyone had allowed, more particular, more full of their own arrangements. The Mariana was the Mariana, and not merely a deep hole. The Kermadec was the Kermadec, with its own slopes and sediments. The New Hebrides was the New Hebrides, fed by its own overlying province and shaped by its own long isolation. To know this is a little like coming to know that three distant valleys on land, which from a great height might look alike, are in truth quite different when you walk in them. One dry, one wet, one grown over with a different green, each holding a different quiet. The variety, the researchers noted, could be seen at more than one scale, and this too is a soft and pleasing thought for the edge of sleep. There was the largest scale, the difference between one whole trench and another, the intertrench difference, the sense in which the three were three. But heterogeneity is a thing that keeps going as you look closer, folding down into finer and finer grain, so that within a single trench there were smaller neighborhoods and smaller ones again, habitats fitted into habitats, a texture that did not smooth out no matter how near you brought your attention. A mind can travel along that scaling as it settles, out from the great and separate trenches, in toward the particular patch of floor, the local slope, the small settled place, each one real, each one distinct, none of them the plain and empty sameness that the old fear had imagined. So the deep, in the light of this work, was not one thing but many, and not a monotony ruled by a single crushing force, but a country of countries, various in the honest way of all living ground, shaped by distance and chemistry and the slow gathering of sediment as much as by the weight of the water. And there was comfort in that, the comfort of finding that a place feared for its emptiness was in fact abundantly itself, full of difference, patterned down to the finest scale, worthy of the long and careful looking that had at last been given to it. 3 trenches had been mapped together for the first time, and the map showed not a single dark answer, but 3 quiet places with their own characters, each keeping its own shape and water and particular arrangement of the ground, all patient, various, exactly and only what it was. A person could carry that gentle fact down towards sleep, the knowledge that the deep was not one darkness but many, and that each of them was simply, calmly, itself. Life in the dark water. There was a smaller life than the great creatures the old stories had feared, a life too small to be seen at all, and it was to this that the attention of the deep now quietly turned. Beneath the fish and the drifting shapes, beneath even the sediment that had settled grain by grain across the long floor of the trenches, there lived a population without eyes or bones or any sense of their own multitude, and yet they were, by any honest reckoning, the true inhabitants of the dark water. They were the microbes, the single cells, countless past any counting a person might attempt, and they filled the deepest water the way breath fills a sleeping room, evenly, without announcement, present in every part of it at once. Scientists had gone looking for them in the Hadal Zone, in that band of water that lay between roughly 6,000 meters and the very deepest sounding of about 10,257 meters. What they had begun to find was gently surprising. The communities that lived down there in the crushing water of the trenches were not simply the same communities that lived higher up, pressed a little thinner or slowed a little more by the cold and the weight. They were distinct. They were their own. The cells that thrived in the Hadal water differed from the cells that thrived in the abyssal water above them, and the difference reached down to the finest level the instruments could resolve, to the level of the species themselves. This finding was still an emerging one, held carefully by the people who had made it, offered as a leading idea rather than a settled fact. That caution was itself a kind of comfort, a sign of how patiently the looking was being done. But the pattern they described was clear. Among the dominant kinds of microbe, the ones that made up the great bulk of the population, the researchers had seen what they called a species-level niche separation between the Hadal and the abyssal worlds. It was as though a boundary ran through the water, not a wall a person could touch, not anything visible to any eye, but a real division all the same, marked out by which cells did well on one side of it and which did well on the other. The deep water and the water above it were, in this small living sense, 2 different places, each with its own residence, each holding its own quiet arrangement of life. And the reason for that separation, so far as the leading idea went, had to do with the shape of the place itself. The Mariana Trench, where much of this work had been done, was a long and narrow and deeply isolated form, a trough sunk into the floor of the ocean and walled by the slopes that rose on either side of it. The scientists had come to suspect that this shape, this particular geometry of the ground, did more than simply hold the water. They thought it helped to make the life. Their hypothesis, offered as a hypothesis and phrased as one, was that the distinct community of the Hadal depths was driven by something they called the endogenous recycling of organic matter, which is to say a turning of nourishment within the trench itself, a keeping and reusing of what fell there rather than a constant reliance on what arrived fresh from far above. It was a gentle picture when a person let it settle. Imagine the trench as a kind of long, closed bowl, its steep walls gathering to itself the material that drifted down, its isolated hydrotopography, holding the fallen matter in place rather than letting it wash freely away. And within that held space, the microbes went about their work, breaking down what had come to them, releasing what those substances contained, feeding one upon the leavings of another, so that a single scrap of organic matter might pass through many hands, so to speak, many cells, before it was finally spent. The nourishment of that world was, to a meaningful degree, its own. It circled. It returned. What the surface sent down was taken up and worked again, and in that patient, internal turning, the community of the deep water found the particular character that set it apart from the water above. There was a quiet economy in this, an economy of a closed and thrifty place. Higher up in the upper abyssal water, there lived a greater share of a certain kind of cell, the chemolithotrophic kind, the cells that could draw their living from the plain chemistry of their surroundings, from the inorganic substances dissolved in the water, rather than from the remains of things that had once been alive. And in the Hadal water, deeper down, those chemical feeders were found to be less abundant. They had not vanished, they were simply fewer, a smaller portion of the whole than they had been in the water above. This too was part of the emerging picture, another thread of the same careful study, and it fit with the rest of it in a way that felt almost restful to follow. Where the upper water leaned more upon the raw chemistry of the deep, drawing life directly from the mineral world, the Hadal water leaned more upon itself, upon the recycling of what had already lived, upon the long, slow passing around of organic matter within the sheltered bowl of the trench. None of this was hurried. None of it was fierce. A person raised on the old tales might have expected the deepest water of all to be the most terrible, the most hostile, the place where life gave out entirely and only darkness remained. Instead, the finding was that life was there, thriving in its fashion, arranged into its own communities with their own boundaries and their own quiet ways of feeding, a whole living order carrying on in a world that no light had ever reached. The cells did not know they were deep. They did not know they were feared. They simply lived where they lived, turning matter over, taking up and releasing, keeping the long recycling in motion. And there was something worth carrying towards sleep in the smallness of it, in the fact that the great drama of the deep, once imagined in terms of enormous jaws and coiling shapes and monstrous appetites, had come at last to rest upon the doings of things too little to see. The true life of the trenches was microbial. It was patient beyond patience. It asked for nothing but what fell to it and what it could pass among itself, and from that modest arrangement it built a world distinct enough that scientists could tell, from the water alone, whether they were sampling the abyss or the Hadal depth below it. The cells kept the record. The cells drew the line. The character of each depth was written, in the end, in the living population that had come to suit it. The researchers held all of this loosely, as good researchers do, calling it a hypothesis, calling the separation an emerging finding, leaving room for the water to teach them more than they yet knew. They were not certain of every mechanism. The leading idea was the recycling, the turning of nourishment within the isolated shape of the trench, but they said so as an idea, a well-founded and carefully reasoned one, still open to the long testing that such ideas require. And that openness sat easily alongside the calm of the thing. There was no rush to close the question. There was only the trench, and the water in it, and the countless small cells living their divided lives at the two great levels of the deep, the abyssal above and the Hadal below, each level with its own residence, each keeping its own quiet books of what was taken in and what was given back. A person could rest in that. The deepest water in the world was not empty and was not a mouth waiting in the dark. It was inhabited, thoroughly and quietly inhabited, by a life so small and so self-contained that it had made the very bottom of the sea into a place of its own, patient and various and endlessly turning, feeding itself upon itself in the sheltered hollow of the trench, exactly and only what it was. Hands that reach the bottom. And so the question turned, as it often did on that quiet deck, from what lived in the deep to how a person might ever come to know it, gently, without harm. For there was a difficulty in the very wish to look closely, and it was a tender kind of difficulty, the sort that arises whenever something small and soft is held by something large and strong. A creature that had spent its whole life in the stillness of the abyss, unbothered by weather, untouched by hands, was not built to be seized. It was built to drift, to hang, to settle, to be carried by water so slow that it might as well have been standing still. And to bring such a thing up into the light, to study it and learn from it, someone would have to reach down through the enormous cold and take hold of it, and the taking would have to be careful beyond ordinary care. The first tools sent down to do this reaching had not been made for tenderness at all. They had been made for work, for the heavy and stubborn business of the deep, for turning valves and lifting weights and holding fast against the drag of the current. These were the industrial grippers, the mechanical hands mounted on the arms of remotely operated vehicles, and they had been designed from the beginning for tasks that asked for force rather than finesse. They could clamp, bear a great load, close upon a thing and not let it go. But the collection of a delicate specimen, a soft and living creature of biological interest, was a different matter entirely, and the difference was one that the old tools could not easily cross. To sample the fragile life of the deep was a long procedure, expensive, asking for dexterity and precision, for a lightness of touch, qualities those hands built for heavy manipulation had never been asked to have. There was something almost gentle in the recognition of this mismatch, something that sat well with the calm of the water it described. It was the simple admission that a strong hand is not always the right hand, that the same grip which serves so well against the weight of iron will serve very poorly against the softness of a living thing that has never known weight at all. A person on the deck could understand this without any strain, feeling the truth in the memory of their own hands, holding a heavy stone with the whole fist and a moth with almost nothing, fingertips barely closed, breath half held. The deep asked for the moth's grip, and the tools sent down to it had begun their long life knowing only the grip for stones. And yet the knowing of the problem was itself the beginning of its easing, for the people who built these underwater hands had begun, in the quiet way that patient work proceeds, to change what they were trying to do. In earlier years, much effort went into a kind of proving, showing that a particular idea could work at all beneath the sea, that a way of moving a joint or carrying force from one place to another or sensing the world through a fingertip could survive the cold and dark and still do what it was meant to do. This was worthy work, the work of demonstration, establishing that a chosen technology belonged in the water. But in more recent years, the focus had turned gently toward something nearer to the heart of the matter. Rather than asking whether given technology could be made to work at all, newer work began to ask what the deep actually needed, what specific problems of handling and holding and gathering stood in the way, and how a tool might be shaped to answer those problems and no others. It was a turning from the general to the particular, from proving a thing possible to making it useful, carrying within it a kind of humility, an attention to the real needs of the task, often the quiet mark of a craft coming into its maturity. This turning was still unfolding, and no one could say it had arrived at any final shape. Scientists and engineers were still learning, trying and refining, finding out by careful degrees what the abyss would permit and what it would not. But the direction of the learning was clear enough to rest upon, bending toward gentleness, toward the specimen rather than the machine, toward the fragile creature waiting to be lifted rather than the cleverness of the arm that would lift it. In this bending, there was a whole philosophy of touch, worked out not in words, but in the slow adjustment of tools, in the patient asking of what the deep-sea life truly required of the hands that came to meet it. Even so, the older grippers had not been set aside. They had a quiet usefulness of their own. Their story was not one of failure, but of limits honestly met. The commonly used grippers could still do the plain and necessary things: grip, closing upon a specimen to hold it; cage, gathering a creature into an enclosure so that it might be carried up without being clutched at all. These were the basic actions, the foundation upon which everything finer was built, reliable in the way simple things are reliable. And where a gripper's reach fell short, its usefulness could be extended not by making the hand itself more clever, but by letting it hold the proper tool for the task at hand, so that the strong, plain grip became the means of carrying some finer instrument down into the dark. In this way, even a hand made for heavy work could serve a delicate end, provided it was given the right thing to hold, provided the tenderness lived in the tool rather than in the grip. It was a familiar arrangement, by which a person's broad and ordinary hand comes to do fine work not by growing more delicate itself, but by taking up a needle, brush, or tweezers, lending its steadiness to the smaller thing. There was a great and quiet patience in all of this, the patience of people leaning over their designs far above the water, thinking not of conquest, but of care. They were not trying to master the deep, they were trying to learn how to touch it without breaking what they touched, a slower and more thoughtful ambition than mastery, kinder. Each new gripping hand, each refinement of a joint or fingertip, each choice to solve one real need rather than prove one clever idea was a small act of courtesy extended downward through the miles of cold water toward creatures that would never know the courtesy had been paid. And that perhaps was the most touching thing about it. The soft animals of the abyss had no notion anyone was troubling to be gentle with them, no way to sense the years of careful thought that went into the manner of their lifting. The gentleness was entirely one-sided, given without any hope of being noticed, offered simply because it was the right way to meet a fragile thing. So the picture that settled over the deck in the last of the thinking before rest was not one of grasping or taking, but reaching slowly and with great attention toward a life that had to be met on its own soft terms. The deep was still mostly unhandled, untouched by any instrument at all, and what little touching had been done was being done more carefully with every passing year, by hands learning patiently the difference between holding fast and holding kindly. There was no urgency in the work, and none needed. Specimens would keep, trenches would keep, soft and drifting creatures would go on drifting in their unweighted dark, tools quietly improving above them. Somewhere in the meeting of the two, in the gentleness sent down and the fragility waiting below, there was a thing worth resting in, the plain and hopeful fact that people had chosen, when they finally reached the bottom, to reach for it with open and careful hands. How little we have seen. There is a particular kind of humility that comes not from being frightened by a thing, but from simply understanding how large it is, and how little of it one has actually walked through. This was the humility that had settled quietly over everyone who spent their lives leaning toward the deep. For all the sounding lines that had been lowered, and all the nets that had been drawn slowly up through the cold, and all the careful vessels that had been sent down into the dark and brought back again, the plain truth remained that the greater part of the ocean floor had never been seen by any human eye, and the greater part of the life that moved through the deep had never been named or drawn or held gently in a gloved hand or recorded in any book at all. This was not a shameful fact and not a frightening one. It was, if anything, a comfort, the way it is a comfort to stand at the edge of a very old forest and know that it goes on further than you will ever walk, that there are clearings in it you will never come to, that its quietness does not depend on you. The people who studied the sea had grown used to living inside this largeness, and they spoke of it without alarm. They knew that every time a vessel went down and came back, it carried with it some small creature that had not been described before, a soft, translucent thing, a pale and patient animal built for a life without light. And they knew that for each one they lifted gently into the record, there were surely many more still drifting far below, unmet, unhurried, entirely themselves. The map of what was known grew a little each year, filled in slowly and with care, while the map of what remained unknown stayed vast beyond easy telling. Both of these facts could be held at once in the mind, side by side, without one crowding out the other. To know a little was not to have lost the wonder of not knowing the rest. It was more truly to have found the doorway into it. And yet those same patient people carried alongside their wonder a gentle and clear-eyed awareness that the sea was not untouched by the world above it, and that the choices made on the surface, in harbors and markets and distant inland places, reached down further than anyone had once imagined. When they gathered what they had learned across many regions and set it beside itself to see what patterns emerged, they found that the greatest pressures upon the living variety of the sea came, more than anything else, from two familiar sources: the taking of too much, the steady overfishing that drew life up faster than it could quietly replace itself, and pollution, the slow arrival of substances that did not belong. These two stood first among the threats, named plainly and without exaggeration. Behind them followed others, spoken of in the same measured way: the arrival of species carried into waters where they had not lived before, the gradual altering of temperature, the slow acidification of the water itself, and the thinning of oxygen in places that had once held enough. It was a sober list, and it was read soberly, but it was not read as a story of doom. It was read the way a careful gardener reads the condition of the soil, as something to be understood so that it might be tended. There was in all of this a quiet tension that the people who loved the deep felt keenly, and it was worth resting in rather than turning away from. On the one hand, there was the unhurried patience of discovery, the sense that the trenches would keep, and the specimens would keep, and the drifting creatures would go on drifting, whether they were named this year or in 100 years. And on the other hand, there was a newer awareness, still taking shape in the minds of those who studied the sea most closely, that some of what lay below might slip quietly out of the world before it was ever known at all. This was the emerging thought, held not as certainty, but as a growing sense among many, that the discovery of marine life ought perhaps to be gently hastened, not out of greed and not out of the old hunger to conquer and count, but simply because much of that life might be lost without anyone ever having known that it was there to begin with. It was a strange and tender kind of urgency, the urgency not to seize but to witness, to arrive in time to say, before anything else, that a thing had existed and had been beautiful and had belonged. One could hold this thought softly, turning it over in the last drowsy reaches of the day, and find in it something that was not heavy at all. For there was a kind of love in it, the love that hurries to a bedside not to take, but to be present, the love that walks quickly through the last light of an evening, not because the walk must end, but because the walker wishes to see as much of the garden as the day still allows. The people who spoke of accelerating the discovery of the deep spoke in this register. They did not wish to strip the sea bare or drag its secrets up all at once. They wished, more gently than that, to make sure that the slow and careful reaching downward, the open and kindly hands that had been the subject of so much of this quiet work, would go on reaching while there was still so much waiting to be reached, and would not one day find that the thing it had hoped to meet had drifted, unnoticed and unrecorded, out of reach forever. And so the two threads of the story ran side by side, the vast and comforting unknown and the gentle wish to know it before it was diminished. Neither one cancelled the other. There was still, and there would remain for a very long time, more of the deep unseen than seen, more of it unnamed than named, more of it drifting in its unweighted dark than had ever been drawn up into the light of any laboratory. That fact would not change soon, and there was rest to be found in its steadiness. But woven through it now was a soft resolve, a decision made not with fear, but with care, to pay attention, to take less, to let the water hold its oxygen and its coolness and its old clean chemistry, and to send down instruments not to plunder, but to greet. It was possible, lying still in the dark, to imagine the whole of it at once, though gently, without straining, the enormous body of the sea, most of it never mapped, holding within itself a variety of life that no one had finished counting, and perhaps never would. And above it were the small, careful figures of the people who had come to love it, learning slowly what pressed upon it, and choosing, more thoughtfully with each year, to press a little less. There was no crisis in this image, only a kind of ongoing and open-ended tending, the sort of quiet stewardship that has no single ending point and asks for no sudden heroics, only steadiness, only attention, only the willingness to keep reaching kindly downward and to keep drawing back one's own hand from anything held too roughly. So the plainest and most hopeful fact of all was simply this: how little had been seen was not a wound, but an invitation. And that invitation was being answered, slowly and imperfectly, and with growing care, by people who understood both how much remained and how much depended on the way they went about finding it. The deep would keep most of its secrets for now, and would give up a few more each year to those who came gently, and the great work of the age was learning to come gently enough, and soon enough, that the giving and the keeping might both go on. That was enough to hold in the mind as the light went low. The sea was vast and mostly unmet, and cared for a little better than it had been. And there was room in all that darkness, unhurried and unafraid, for a person to let the day go and rest. What the charts still hold. The deck had gone quiet in the way it does late at night, when the last of the working sounds have settled and only the small ones remain, the tap of a line against a mast, the long soft exhale of water moving along the hull, the faint creak of a vessel easing itself against the swell. There was nothing left to do out here, and nothing that needed doing, and the person who stood at the rail stood there simply because standing was pleasant, because the dark was warm rather than fearful, because the sea below had been made a little more familiar over the long hours of this telling. And that was, in the end, most of what there was to hold on to, not a conclusion exactly, but a settling. The charts still held their empty places, the wide pale reaches where no line had reached and no light had gone, left honestly blank, waiting, the way a page is left blank when there is nothing yet to say. There was a kind of peace in that blankness. It did not demand to be filled tonight. It helped perhaps to remember how the knowing had come, slowly, by instrument, and by patient hands writing down what they saw so that other hands, years later, might read it and see the same. That was one of the quieter truths of the whole long work, worth turning over slowly in the mind, the way one turns a smooth stone in a pocket. When people had good guides to what lived in a place, careful descriptions, drawings, their knowledge of that place grew richer. They knew more of the species that lived there and more too of the newcomers, the ones that had arrived from elsewhere. Where the guides were good, the knowing was good. Where the guides were thin, the knowing stayed thin. It was a simple relationship, almost obvious once it was said aloud, and yet it explained a great deal about why the deep had stayed unknown for so long and why it had begun at last to be known. For the deep had never given up its inhabitants easily. It did not hand over a catalogue. Each creature that was known because someone had brought it up into the light or sent a lens down to meet it, and then had done the slower and less glamorous thing, writing and drawing and careful setting down so that the creature could be recognized again. A single strange animal hauled from the dark was a wonder, a guide that let the next person name it was knowledge. A knowledge gathered this way, page by page and specimen by specimen, was how the great blankness on the charts had begun very gradually to be edged with names. The person at the rail let that thought stretch out and go loose. There was no hurry in it. The making of guides was slow work, and the deep was patient, and the two seemed suited to one another. The long dark that had waited so long already, and the long attention that was, at last, beginning to answer it. Somewhere below, far beneath the moving surface, the creatures went on with their lives indifferent to whether they had yet been named. They had been there before the naming and would be there after, and the naming changed nothing for them except this, that it changed the people who did the naming, who could not care for what they could not see, and could not see what they had no way to recognize. To know a place was the first small step toward keeping it. That too was worth holding gently in the mind as the night went on. Because the keeping mattered. It had come up softly through the telling and came up softly again now, not as alarm but as a plain fact, set down the way true things were set down, without weight thrown onto it. The living sea faced its troubles, and the troubles were known and counted and ranked. Among them, the loss of places where creatures made their homes stood high, and close behind it stood the fouling of the waters, the pollution that spread where it was not wanted. These were named among the greatest pressures the sea's life carried, reckoned across wide regions of the world. It was not said here to trouble anyone's rest. It was said because it was true, and because the same careful attention that made the guides notice these things, and the two went together. To look closely at the sea was to see both its abundance and its wear, and an honest looking held both at once, without turning away from either. And there was something almost restful in that honesty, the way there is something restful in a friend who tells you plainly how things stand. The sea was vast and mostly unmet. It was also touched, at its edges and increasingly in its depths, by the hands and leavings of people far away. Both were true. Neither cancelled the other. The wonder did not require that the deep be untouched, and the care did not require that it be ruined. It only required that it be seen clearly and set down carefully so that the seeing might be shared. The swell lifted the deck and let it fall, a rhythm so old and even that the body had long since stopped noticing it and begun instead to move with it, the way the body learns to move with anything steady and kind. The rail was cool under the hands, the dark overhead held its scatter of stars, and the dark below held its scatter of lives. Between them, the small lit deck floated, a place from which the whole vast quiet arrangement could be considered without fear. There was no need to hold all of it at once. The trenches, the maps left open where honesty required it, all laid out over long hours, none needing carrying now. It could be set down, the way a traveler sets down a pack at the end of a day, and knows the road will still be there in the morning. For the work would go on without the watchers watching. That was the last easy thing to rest against. The guides would keep being written, a little more each year. The blank places would keep being edged with names, slowly, imperfectly, by people who understood that naming and keeping were one task with two faces. The deep would keep most of itself to itself, as it always had, and offer a little more to those who came gently. Coming gently was itself being learned, part of the great unhurried work of the age. None of that required a single further thought tonight. It was in hand, in better hands than before. That was enough. The person at the rail breathed cool salt air and felt how far down the water went. The feeling was not old dread, but something nearer to gratitude. The plain comfort of standing above a great unknown that meant no harm and asked no vigilance, that would go on being deep and dark and full of quiet life, whether one kept watch over it or not. The charts still held their empty places. They would fill a little and stay mostly empty, as they should for a while yet. And so there was nothing left to do but what the hour asked. Let eyes go soft, hands loosen on the rail, mind drift down through calm water of its own tiredness, unafraid, unhurried, into long dark that held so much and asked so little, and rest. The quiet deep. The night had not changed much, and that was its kindness. The same cool air moved across the deck, the same faint creak came and went in the timbers, and the water that stretched away on every side kept its slow dark breathing, rising and settling, as it had all along, and would go on doing long after the watch was over. There was nothing now that needed saying that had not already been said, and so the mind, standing at the rail, did not so much think as let things drift by, one after another, the way small lights on a far shore slide past a slow boat, asking nothing, meaning no harm. It remembered, without effort, the old names. Leviathan, coiled somewhere in the deep water of an old imagination, vast and unhurried. The Kraken that had risen in so many tellings out of the dark to trouble the surface, and that had settled now, in the mind's easy drifting, back into the quiet from which it came. Scylla and Charybdis, the narrow fear of the passage, the water that pulled and the shape that waited, all of them gentled now, softened by the hour, no longer standing guard at any strait, but simply part of the long story the sea had gathered to itself, the way a shoreline gathers driftwood and smooths it and lets it lie. And the maps, too, drifted past, with their careful coastlines and their honest empty middles, meaning only that no one yet knew, meaning only here we have not been, here we cannot say. That was all it had ever meant. And it was a peaceful thing to know now, in the dark, that not knowing had never truly been the same as danger. The person at the rail breathed slowly and let the memory of the measuring drift up as well, and it came without weight. The long patience of the sounding line, the rope paid out hand over hand into water that would not give back a bottom, the slow lowering and the slower waiting, the way people had once tried to touch the deep with nothing but a weight and a length of cord, and their own willingness to keep letting out more. And then the ship that had gone out to do it properly, sailing from place to place across the wide water, lowering its lines again and again, bringing up mud and small strange living things from depths no one had reached before, patient, thorough, unhurried, learning the shape of the deep one careful reading at a time. And the trenches at the very bottom of it all, the hadal places, deep and dark and far from the sun, though nothing in them wished anyone ill. All of it drifted past, one image after another, and none of it startled, and none of it needed answering. There was a long pause then, the kind the sea allows, in which the mind simply rested on the fact of how much water there was, and how far down it went, and how little of it had ever been seen by anyone at all. Most of the deep remained unmapped. Still, even now, even after all the careful looking, the empty places on the charts had shrunk a little and would shrink a little more, and still they would stay mostly empty for a good while yet, and there was no sorrow in that, only a kind of spaciousness, a sense that the world was larger than any single watch could hold, and that this was as it should be. One did not have to know everything to rest. One did not have to keep watch over the dark to be safe in it. The deep would go on being deep whether or not any eye was turned toward it, and the small lives within it would go on being small and living, in the cold and the pressure and the long unbroken quiet, needing nothing from the surface, asking nothing of the person at the rail. The mind drifted a little further, and it came to the plainer things, the daylight cares, and even these had lost their edge in the softness of the hour. It remembered that the greatest threat to the life of the sea, in every region that had been studied, was the taking of too many fish. The simple, ordinary fact of overfishing, reported the same way from place to place, a thing that could be seen and named, and being named, could be tended to. And it remembered the other quieter harms that had been spoken of, the ways the shallow edges of the sea were worn down and troubled, the growing of towns along the coasts, the wash of sediment carried off the land into the water, the too much of nutrients that came from sewage and from the fertilizer of fields, and that could leave the water starved of the very air its creatures needed. The slow rise of the sea itself. The melting of the ice at the poles. The blasting and the scraping and the dragging along the bottom that broke apart the places where things lived. These were named in the mind's slow passage over them, not as terrors, but as things that were understood, things that could be seen plainly and set right by people who cared to, and the person at the rail felt again what had been felt earlier in the night, that these matters were in hand, in better hands than before, and that the caring did not have to happen now, in the dark, by one tired mind alone. It could wait for morning. It could wait for others. It was enough, tonight, to have looked at it honestly and to have set it gently down. And so it was set down. The threats and the wonders, the old monsters and the true creatures, the fear that had once been written into the empty places, and the patient knowledge that had begun, slowly, to fill a few of them, all of it settled, the way silt settles in still water, drifting down through the dark without hurry, coming to rest somewhere far below where it would lie undisturbed. There was nothing rising toward the surface now. There was nothing that needed answering. The sea held its great weight of water and its far greater weight of quiet, and it held them easily, without strain, the way it always had. The rail was cool under loosening hands. The salt air came and went, cool and clean, and the ship moved as it moved, rising and settling on the slow swell, and the sound of the water against the hull was the oldest and most patient sound there was, a sound that asked nothing, that had rocked countless watches into rest before this one and would rock countless more. The stars, if there were stars, kept their distances. The deep kept its dark. And between the two, the small warm fact of a breathing body stood for a moment longer at the rail, no longer keeping watch, no longer needing to, only present, only here, only grateful in the plain, unhurried way of someone who has come to the end of a long and gentle telling, and finds that there is nothing left to fear in it and nothing left to do. The eyes had gone soft some while ago. The hands had loosened. The mind, which had drifted so far and so easily, drifted now the last little way, down through the calm water of its own tiredness, past the old names that no longer troubled it, past the maps with their honest empty places, past the sounding lines and the patient ships, down and down into the long quiet that held so much and asked so little, unafraid, unhurried, carried by the slow rise and settle of the swell, into the deep and welcome dark of sleep. And the sea went on being deep and dark and full of quiet life, whether or not anyone kept watch over it, exactly as it should, exactly as it would, all through the long and gentle night. There was nothing more. There was only rest. And rest was enough.